Hello and welcome to Viewpoint on Ukraine Today. On January 6th, Ukrainian dissident poet Vasyl Stus would have turned 78 years old. The well-known figure spent more than 20 years in Soviet prison camps, where he later died at the age of 47. 30 years later, mystery still surrounds his death. Stus was seen as a symbol of resistance against Soviet repressions. Many believe this is precisely why he may have been killed. Joining me to discuss this key figure in Ukraine's dissident movement is Roman Verytelnyk, Ukrainian professor of literature at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Welcome to Viewpoint.
Thank you.
So why do you think the Soviet authorities saw Stus's work as such a threat?
For a number of reasons. First of all, his poetry, which was written in a way that was not acceptable as an expectation for the way poets were supposed to write. It was considered not understandable, decadent, and other terminology was used to describe his poetry. And
he was also critical of the government, of the Soviet authorities.
It really wasn't. It was actually poetry, as any good poetry. It was very difficult to pin down that it was political. It really wasn't. It was about all kinds of things, about motherhood, about love. There are certain erotic poems, certainly about a sense of belonging, a sense of self, but there was nothing really overtly political about his poetry, which probably sounds, I guess, strange today when we think about the legacy of Vasyl Stus. But that type of poetry was expected to be political. That's really what got him into trouble. And his poetry wasn't. It was sort of centered on the person, on the human being, which, again, was not what poets were supposed to be doing at the time.
So it wasn't in line with the Soviet authorities' way of how literature was supposed to be at the time, and anything of that?
It wasn't, no. And there was that presented a conundrum for the authorities. What do you do with a poet who writes in a way that Vasyl Stus wrote? Plus, his friendship with other key members of the Ukrainian 60s movement, for instance, with people like Ivan Svetlichny, who were subsequently arrested, and certain events, like the premiere showing of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors in the 60s in downtown Kyiv, which the premiere showing was stopped when a number of people, headed by Ivan Dyuba, appealed to those present to protest the arrests that were going on and the repressions that were beginning. And Vasyl Stus was one of the people who also appealed to the audience to also, if they were against these repressions, to stand up and have their voices counted.
And did a lot of people get up?
There's a lot of controversy about that. Depending on there's still a lot of people alive who were at the movie theater at the time, and some say that half the audience got up. Others say very few got up. Still others say that very many got up. So it's very difficult to say at this point exactly how many people got up. The showing was certainly stopped, and members of the KGB were outside waiting. So certainly the thing was planned. The whole they knew that something might have happened.
Right. So Vasyl Stus is seen as a key figure in the dissident movement, but do a lot of Ukrainians now know about his work, particularly his poems?
Because Vasyl Stus is taught in schools, a lot of young Ukrainians probably know him. He's required reading in Ukrainian schools, which is a separate question in itself, because the question being whether that type of poetry, that type of difficult poetry, should be taught, not perhaps difficult, I didn't mean to say, but complex poetry, should be taught to school children. That's a question in itself.
So it's kind of difficult to understand what his poetry means.
I guess a reader has to be prepared to read his poetry, meaning a reader has to be grounded in poetry itself, in literature itself. Although some of his poems, his lyrical poems, can probably be read by people who don't have that kind of preparation. But to add to the answer to your question, a number of years ago there was an attempt to rename Donetsk University as Vasyl Stus University. And at that time there was...
And Vasyl Stus grew up in the Donetsk region.
Exactly. And at that time there was total opposition among the university community there to do that. So that indicates how in eastern Ukraine many people certainly weren't prepared to accept Vasyl Stus as a symbol of Ukrainian statehood, despite the fact that he was, one can consider him one of their own, certainly him growing up in Donetsk. It's probably a very regional thing. In some parts of Ukraine, Stus is very well known. In other parts, he is less well known.
Now, there's a very interesting piece of information that when he was arrested for the second time in the 1980s, his lawyer was Viktor Medvedchuk, and he's now a very close associate of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, do you think that's a coincidence? What's your take on this?
Well, at the time, I think Mr. Medvedchuk was just a lawyer in the system, and he did what any other lawyer at that time would have done in an instance like that, where a dissident was arrested, and the outcome was known. I mean, lawyer or no lawyer, Vasyl Stus would have been sentenced to Mordovia and to exile. Now, that is not to absolve Mr. Medvedchuk of blame, because he certainly took part in the process. But I guess this incident shows the way the machine worked at the time. The system wanted to destroy Vasyl Stus, a poet, a major poet, and it did it. And it certainly did it utilizing everything at its arsenal: the court system, the lawyers, the prosecutors, etc. So he was probably no more and no less than just a part of the system that condemned Vasyl Stus to his sentence and ultimately to his death.
I see. When Vasyl Stus was reburied in the 1980s, tens of thousands of people came to the streets in Kyiv. It was a major procession, one of the biggest ones known to date. Why do you think so many people came to the streets? Did his work have such a great impact on their lives?
Yes, it was 1989 was certainly a time when many things were changing. Probably for the first time in many years, the idea of Ukrainian statehood was becoming a real thought for many Ukrainians. And many of the people who had been part of the 1960s movement were at the forefront of this new drive for change, for the establishment of an independent Ukraine. And certainly Vasyl Stus, who had perished in 1985, just 4 years prior to this, was certainly very much alive in the memory of very many people. And he was someone who probably a lot of people thought about because of the fact that he was a great poet. Again, it would have been... Thousands died, millions died in the Gulag in the previous decades. But Vasyl Stus, his poetry was published during Soviet times, of course, in the West, and it was known by many people, and they certainly, in that act that you're describing, they certainly demonstrated an incredible. This was a demonstration that they didn't want to be afraid anymore to come out into the streets.
So they wanted to show their support and to show that they will not keep up with the kind of repression that he had to face.
Very much so, that they wanted the system to end the way it was, and they were willing to risk a lot by being out in the streets. Let's remember that 1989, even though perestroika was already sort of underway and Mr. Gorbachev was in office, the system was still very much in place. So by coming out into the streets at that time, people risked a lot. But by doing so, again, they showed their lack of fear, which again, Ukrainians would show subsequently during the student revolt, not too long after that, during 2004, and 2 years ago, again, during Maidan, the last Maidan, that it was high time to say no to the things that were going on.
Vasyl Stus, a very important figure in Ukraine's dissident movement. Mm-hmm. We're remembering him. We will remember him.
Yes.
And
yes, I just wanted to add to your question about Viktor Medvedchuk. I know that the Stus family, one thing that they still think about when Mr. Medvedchuk is mentioned, that he failed to, as Vasyl Stus's defense lawyer, he failed to notify Vasyl Stus's wife, Valentina Popelyukh. He didn't notify her as to the trial, so she wasn't present. So, well, I don't think that needs any commentary.
Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
This has been Mr. Roman Verytelnyk. He's a Ukrainian professor of literature at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. You've been watching Viewpoint on Ukraine Today.